الرياضي، كل ما يخص تسويق الأندية الرياضية عموما. بنوفر برامج ولقاءات ودورات تدريبية حتكون برضو من ضمن الخطة المستقبلية، بالإضافة إنه نحن نطمح إلى عقد اتفاقيات مع جهات مختلفة لتبادل الخبرات ونقل المعرفة. وبنحضر حاليا لمؤتمر يضم نخبة متميزة من الباحثين والمتحدثين في مجال التسويق الرياضي خصوصا، وفي مجال دعم القطاع الرياضي عامة. أدعو من الجميع طبعا إنه في مشكلة في الصوت. اوكي سامعين؟ هل في مشكلة في الصوت للجميع ولا فقط شخص واحد؟ اوكي الصوت واضح تمام. طيب طبعا زي ما كنت بقول انه الجمعية الآن بتهدف الى التحضير لمؤتمر يضم نخبة متميزة من الباحثين والمتحدثين في مجال التسويق الرياضي خصوصا في مجال دعم القطاع الرياضي عامة. طبعا أدعو من الجميع أنهم يكونوا أعضاء معنا في الجمعية عشان يحصلوا على الامتيازات ويكونوا يعني يحصلوا على آخر النشرات والدورات التدريبية والمؤتمرات. اليوم عندنا ضيف راح يتكلم عن حاجة مرة مهمة، هي مشكلة ظهرت في كل دول العالم بسبب حدوث جائحة كورونا، ليس فقط في مجال كرة القدم ولكن في أنواع كثيرة من الرياضات اللي هي معظم المباريات الآن بتحصل بدون حضور الجمهور. في أمريكا مثلا الآن بيقيموا مباراة البيسبول بدون حضور الجمهور. الآن طبعا وزارة الرياضة حددت العدد الأقصى لحضور المباراة 300 شخص ما بين الطاقم الفني والتدريبي. فكل المباريات الآن بتكون بدون جمهور، والمعروف إنه الجمهور هم روح الملعب الرياضي. طبعا السؤال المهم الآن اللي إحنا بنفكر فيه، كيف حيكون البرفورمانس الأداء للأندية الرياضية اللي حتكون بدون حضور الجمهور؟ كيف حيكون أداء الحكم حق المباراة؟ هل يتغير الاتيتيود حقه بدون حضور الجمهور؟ طبعا هل بيتغير البرفورمانس إذا كانت الاستاديوم في نفس منطقة النادي أو في منطقة مختلفة؟ هذه كلها الأشياء طبعا أكيد شاغلة كل الفانز المتابعين والمشجعين. اليوم معنا الدكتور جيمس ريد حيتكلم يعرض البحث حقه. هو طبعا قام بمجموعة من الأناليسيز لبعض المباريات اللي حدثت من قبل بدون حضور الجمهور. Hello James.
Hello.
Yes, hi. Yes, Dr. James Reed. He's head of the Department of Economics at University of Reading, and he's going to present his research today. He looked at the impact of playing football behind closed doors and in different occasions. And can you share the slide, please, Dr. James?
Yep, just give me one moment. And I have to find the right window.
Yeah, so his research is joint work with two of his colleagues, and we'll leave the question and answer at the end for the last 15-20 minutes. So Dr. James, the floor is yours. So we are happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Just before I start, could I ask how long should I speak for?
Around 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Yes, we need the last 15 minutes for question and answers.
Sure, and obviously if I'm taking too long, please feel free to interrupt me.
Yeah. Okay, don't worry. Thanks a lot.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Saudi Sport Marketing Association for inviting me to talk. It's a great pleasure to spend this time with you remotely, of course, as is the way of things in the time of coronavirus. As Michelle has introduced, I am an economist. I work in the Department of Economics at the University of Reading. I do a lot of my research as an economist using sport. I've used that over a number of years, because sport offers a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of numbers, and it allows us to therefore analyze what's going on in a way that's quite difficult in other parts of the economy. Now, of course, sport matters to the economy as well. So it's not just that it's a passing interest. It's a very important sector here in England. The Premier League, there's billions of pounds being passed around with television deals and players being paid and so on. So it's big business, and hundreds of thousands of fans attending football matches, usually on any given weekend. So what's that meant? What that's meant is that as we move into this time of coronavirus, more opportunities have come up to investigate and think about football and think about sport in a way that perhaps we never thought about previously. And so just before I move on, just to reference, as Michelle did, this is work with a colleague here in Reading, Carl Singleton, and also a colleague in Germany, Dominic Schreier. And so here's a couple of pictures of football in a time of coronavirus. On the right, we have a picture from the first day in which the Bundesliga returned after it was suspended. So in early March, all professional football leagues, bar one, essentially, were suspended around the globe. The one league that remained, certainly the one league in Europe that remained, is this picture on the left here, which is the Belarusian Football League. What you can perhaps also see from this picture is the crowds, A, aren't particularly socially distanced, but B, they're also not particularly large either. And so there's at least two aspects there for us to be thinking about. And this is what's preoccupied quite a bit of the initial research that I did, looking into football in a time of coronavirus, which was, first of all, was there any kind of effect on people going to games? Were people put off by numbers of cases of coronavirus in the local area, in their country? And therefore, did that impact their decision about whether to go out and participate in a mass outdoor event? These are the kinds of events that people have referred to since the lockdown as super spreaders, potential events where we might all be spreading the virus, and therefore there may be more cases as a result of events like this. And so as a result, part of lockdowns that were imposed around the world involved restricting outdoor gatherings to small numbers of people. So most football stopped for a long time, and then it began again. And so this is a picture of the first day back for the Bundesliga, Germany's premium top league in football. And the stadium is completely empty. I believe the restriction was that there had to be at most 320 people in the entire stadium complex for any of these Bundesliga matches. So that's the 22 men on the field, or women, for the Bundesliga women's league that returned, and all the other associated staff to do with this, even the media contingent reporting on the game, the cameraman, that was the person who even took this photo, for example. But there had to be 320 people at most in the stadium. And so that's two aspects. One is the demand for sport, the demand for doing things when coronavirus hits. And the second thing is, well, what happens if, as a result, as we've seen, we change the sport as a result to fit within coronavirus, so we have no fans in the stadium. And so those are the first two real strands of the research that we've done, and I think these are quite pertinent, and so I'll spend some time talking about them. Essentially, as we probably are well aware, fans in the stadium, or spectators, they play a fundamental role in sport, and the individual experience is a massive part of what we as economists might think of as the output of sport. A football match between 22 men, such as Borussia Dortmund playing Schalke, as in that picture, isn't just those 22 men plus substitutes, isn't just the number of goals that are scored, it's a whole experience. And even we're still experiencing it by looking at pictures of it now. And more than that, crowds believe, so there's literature out there that crowds do actually believe that they can influence outcomes on the field. Fans turn up with their team and they want to try and influence things. And so they try and cheer on their team and hope that they can cheer their team to victory. So spectators are a fundamental part of sport. So as a result, it matters what these spectators do, and it matters because they also have an influence on the outcomes as well. So the questions, as I've said, are essentially what will be the impact on spectator demand of COVID-19? We've got essentially two cases that we can look at. We can look at both the weeks and running up to the suspension of the big leagues in Europe, and we can look at the experience in Belarus throughout the time of coronavirus. And then we can look at the games that have taken place since, where there were no spectators present, and think about why things have turned out different as they have. Now, this is research on it's COVID-19 related sports research. It's been presented in the Reading Online Sports Economics Seminars. Now, these are a set of seminars that we started back in March, around about when lockdown started around the world. And we've been putting these on every Friday since then, with lots and lots of highly topical research being presented. I'll link up in the slides a couple of these events a little bit through. All of the events that take place in this series are then on YouTube, and there's a playlist where you can look back at them. We're going to be carrying on with these events through until the middle of September. So if you do want to attend these events and listen to topical research in sport, often relating to COVID-19, please do get in touch with me. So first of all, let's think about the effect on demand. How will football fans, or customers if you like, react to COVID-19? We're thinking here about demand. It's a classic concept in economics. We think about the demand for all sorts of goods, and the amount at which we demand is a function of how much it costs, its price, a function of income, how much income we have to spend, but it's also a function of all sorts of other less easily measurable characteristics. If there's a risk associated with consuming something, perhaps you'll consume less of it, perhaps you'll equally consume more of it. It's sometimes the case that you have more thrill-seeking behavior, risk-seeking behavior, rather than perhaps risk-averse behavior that others might exhibit. So if we are risk-averse, well, what about when we're thinking about attending a mass outdoor sporting event like a football match, when we know that there's been a certain number of deaths and a certain number of cases of coronavirus in our area? We know it's an airborne disease, a virus that can spread quite easily and can cause quite severe pneumonia, and obviously can affect quite badly a lot of people, can overwhelm health services. Do fans ignore that because the game's more important, and should they? So I mean, by that what I mean is, I'm going to talk about research that I've done, but also there's a public health aspect to this as well, and this is ongoing research that I'm doing, and others have published based on this already, which is there a genuine public health concern about having events with fans in? Can we show that if there are a number of these kinds of events in an area, that there's then a spike? So it's been argued that at least 2 football matches led to spikes in coronavirus, one being a match between Atalanta and Valencia, an Italian and Spanish team, which took place in Milan just as as coronavirus was spreading in northern Italy. And it's argued that helped foster the spread, not just around Milan, because Bergamo, where Atalanta is from, is seen as the epicenter of COVID-19 in Italy, but also then the spread in Spain as well. And equally, Atletico Madrid went to play a football match in Liverpool, England. And again, it's argued that there may well have been a spread of coronavirus across borders there, because a number of thousand fans turned up from Madrid into Liverpool and took part in the game, shouted, sung a lot, celebrated because they won the match, and perhaps they also left coronavirus as well when they left Liverpool at the end of the match. So is there a public health argument that actually these games shouldn't take place? Equally, is there actually a public health argument that maybe they can take place? And all these things, all these kinds of questions, we can at least have a first pass at answering them by looking at the data, looking at the numbers that are out there. And so in the first instance, I'm going to refer to a couple of studies. First one on elite football by myself and my co-author Carl Singleton, and then a study on Belarusian football, which is work that I've done with Dominic Schreier and Carl. So thinking firstly about elite football, what we did here is we collected matches in England, France, Germany, and Italy, and Spain, what are considered to be the big 5 leagues in football, certainly in European football. And we looked at all matches since Christmas. And then we thought, well, is there an effect as when we moved into late February into March and cases were being announced and deaths were being announced of coronavirus, was there some measurable effect therefore on attendance at stadiums? The numbers fall as in the stadium as the numbers were increasing outside the stadium, so to speak. And so what we've done here is we've looked at these matches, we looked at games on particular match days, and we've asked the question, well, do more domestic deaths or domestic cases, for example, lead to fewer attendances in the stadium? In these tables, the asterisks represent significant effects. So you can see that by and large the effects are not necessarily large, and sometimes they're insignificant statistically. Sometimes they're significant statistically, and so we can say that in the case of Italy, new domestic deaths led to a significant and negative effect on match day attendance. This is log stadium attendance, so this is something like a 5% fall. In France, worldwide deaths had more of an effect than necessarily local deaths, and this may reflect the fact that, as with England, the coronavirus arrived a little bit later relative to Italy, where it arrived first, and there was quite a quick build-up. So we see some evidence for an effect of coronavirus on and death and cases as well. I've not included the table for cases, but you can check the paper, it's online. And there's a similar kind of effect for cases as well, that there's a negative effect. It doesn't necessarily seem like huge, but there's certainly a negative effect. What about, I mean, in terms of qualifying this, of course, it's worth saying this is pre-lockdown, pre the peak in any of these countries, and pre, mass distress of healthcare systems and all that we've learned about since. Changes in behavior, such as wearing face masks and so on, all sorts of things that have changed in the past, in the intervening 4 or 5 months since early March. So it's not necessarily the case that we can immediately reach from this and say, look, therefore there's an effect of coronavirus on stadium attendance, should we be thinking about allowing fans to return. But nonetheless, what we're seeing here is some kind of effect on elite football, nonetheless, of the coronavirus pandemic as it emerged. Moving to a smaller league, obviously elite football again doesn't necessarily apply to all cases. It doesn't necessarily apply to lower division football in England. It doesn't necessarily apply to other leagues around the world. But one, as mentioned at the start, one league in Belarus carried on. The Belarusian president decided that there would be no lockdown there would be no restrictions either. And so whereas every other league stopped, suspended, the Belarusian league carried on. And so that gives us some data to look at what the effect was on stadium attendance of this pandemic. And so this is a picture giving you, it's a box and whisker plot. So this, the bottom part here tells you, roughly speaking, where most of the spread of the data is. So this is, and these are seasons, so 2016 season, 2017, 18, 19, and then 2020, the post-COVID or the in the midst of COVID-19 season. As I say, these this box and whiskers gives you the distribution. So this middle line here would be the median, and then these would be this would be the interquartile range. So the 50% of the data, if you like, that's most likely. And then we're moving out right to the tails of the data with the line, and a few further big outliers are given these extra blobs that you see here. The main point takeaway here is that there was clearly a subdued level of attendance in the coronavirus season 2020 relative to previous seasons. We've got some attendances way above 10,000. We've got a median attendance of something about, it's going to be about 1,500. So it's not a huge league. I'll give you some sense of the size of the league, that the 75th percentile or the upper quartile is still only about 6,000 fans. But you can see that this has collapsed quite evidently in the year of coronavirus. So we're down to about a median attendance of below 1,000. And that could, of course, all be coincidental. So it's worth looking at things like the announced numbers of deaths and cases. And so this is very simply a look at the data where we're saying, well, was log attendance, or if we take logs so that we can interpret coefficients as percentage effects. And we've got a number of coronavirus cases. Then we look at distinguishing active cases and deaths. And then why are there different columns? Well, these are different columns controlling for different things. So obviously we want, if we looked at a very simple case, well, how many coronavirus cases were there? We can see that this increase in cases has quite a significant negative effect on attendance in the Belarusian Premier League. We obviously want to control for things like team quality and other aspects of matches, and so that's what we do in the second column, and the effect becomes actually slightly bigger. Control for stadium effects and other effects to do with the home team, and again the effect is still bigger than without any of these controls. And finally, we often want to control for stadium capacity, because this will, if a football match is particularly popular, that the stadium reaches capacity, we don't get a true measure of how popular the event was if we only look at the number of people attending, because the number of people attending is constrained by how many people could fit in the stadium. And then if we split this out into active cases, active squared, so quadratic effects, and death squared, and quadratic effects, we find again a significant negative effect of active cases and also of deaths on attendances. So we've got an effect both in elite football, an effect in Belarusian football as well on demand. And this is how people have actually responded. Of course, people in Belarus responded also based on their government's approach to coronavirus as well, which was to some extent dismiss coronavirus as an issue and not take the kinds of steps that other governments around the world took. So again, there are things to be borne in mind when trying to think about implications of this, but it seems clear that there was a negative effect, quite a significant negative effect on attendance because of the effect of COVID-19. And there are likely public health reasons why governing bodies, governments will want to restrict the number of fans that can attend. And these are two papers that again have been presented in our ROSES online seminars, so you can look at presentations of them as well as reading the papers if you Google their titles. We have a paper by Ahama, Haller and Lachner looking at mass gatherings and saying that mass gatherings contributed to the early COVID-19 spread, looking at events that took place in the first half of March, excuse me, on cases, cumulative cases that had occurred by the end of April. And finding a significant effect of these events. Now, these were indoor events, so this was going to watch a hockey match in the US or in Canada, or watching a basketball match. So both things are indoor. Equally, another paper, Kardassi et al., looking at professional sporting events in cities and how they increase seasonal influenza mortality in US cities. So this is a longer term view looking at the incidence of sporting teams in the cities in the US, and looking at the effect over time on influenza mortality and finding significant effects over a long period of time of teams locating in cities. In other words, if people congregate in places, there will be the spread of a virus. So these are in general results for indoor events, and little evidence so far surfaced for outdoor events. I put 3 dots there because with colleagues in Reading, we've been trying to look at this ourselves, both for Italy and for England, where we have quite disaggregated regional data. And the effects really don't seem to be at all strong at all. And this may be the reason why little evidence has surfaced for these outdoor events actually being super spreaders, because negative results, A, they're hard to publish, but B, there's a worry that if you do go out there and say, look, these events don't lead to the spread of the virus, and the virus does spread, there's a consequence to your actions if sporting authorities change their actions based on the advice that you put forward. but the evidence doesn't appear to be particularly strong so far that if there were lots of football matches in a particular area, that there was any kind of spike in coronavirus cases afterwards. Self-demand. The title that Michelle has circulated is about our study looking at the effect on these football matches that have taken place without spectators. Behind closed doors is the jargon in footballing terms, because, well, fans are a fundamental part of the game. Fans are not taking part in these games at the moment. They're having to watch them on TV. And that's got to have an effect, you imagine. Just instinctively, you think, well, these are footballers, they're running around, they've got events taking place around them, and yes, they're focused on the game, but surely all of their circumstances affects how they perform in games. So it's surely going to affect outcomes, you imagine, but also it's going to affect how fans view matches. The social media evidence is that fans find matches without the fans a bit boring, or more boring than matches with fans. The fans make a difference in terms of the intensity, it seems. A lot of the matches that have been on television, they resemble practice games. There doesn't seem to be quite as much at stake in the way the players are running around. And TV companies have piped in artificial sound effects as well. This all affects how fans see games, how fans value games, therefore. And it could well be that this is therefore of less value to television companies to televise and broadcast matches if they're no longer as valuable to fans. And so this then may well affect the value with which, or the amount that television companies are willing to pay sports leagues to broadcast their matches. But how does it affect outcomes, first and foremost? Well, there's a little bit of literature out there. So this is a paper from 2010 by Pedersen, Lidbom and Prix, looking at Italian games that took place behind closed doors. Now, this whole playing a match without fans is usually a punishment. Historically, it's been a punishment for fans misbehaving. So there's a case of hooliganism in Italy, and this led to a reduced difference between teams in red and yellow cards. And that then leads to thinking about the home team and the away team, because this led to a difference in the way in which the away team is being treated. And that then leads us into another literature that many economists have looked at, which is trying to understand how a home team wins more often than an away team in any kind of event, not necessarily just a football match. Why is it that if two teams play each other, it matters where they're playing the match, which team's home ground or home stadium the game has been played in? And the answer is there's no single answer, but there's been a lot of research that's looked at the effect of referees or officials on outcomes. So there's put here a crowd mechanism via the referee, and this is a paper by Garicano and co-authors, and they looked at the amount of extra time, injury time at the end of a football match a referee awards, and they found that it was more if the home team was losing, and it was more still progressively if there were more fans in the stadium. In other words, the referee appears to act to appease home fans, consciously or otherwise. This Boyko paper looks at referees watching back videos of fouls in football matches and finds that the referees will call more fouls against the away team if they can hear the crowd noise. So the crowd has an influence via the referee, not necessarily consciously, probably is subconsciously. Referees are acting under a huge amount of pressure, time pressure to make decisions, and pressure from the two teams that are involved. So referees are under a lot of pressure as it is, and so it's important to emphasize this isn't some kind of attack on referees, to castigate them as being biased in some way or another. It's just to make the point that referees operate in a highly pressurized environment. And so therefore, ways in which that pressure can be relieved somehow may well be good things to be thinking about doing. And a final explanation, well, a couple of other explanations are that, well, teams have to travel to away games, and that's going to have an effect. That depends on the size of a country, of course. If it's America or if it's England, these are two very differently sized countries. But finally, familiarity is something that people have put forward. And so Pollard point out that in the seasons after the Second World War in England, there was a much lower advantage for the home team. And they argue that that's because, well, teams after the Second World War were very different to teams before. Very few of the players would have been playing, so very few of the players would have been familiar with the home surrounds, and so as a result, home advantage was less. But if you look at, and I'll show you a plot later, if you look at home advantage over this long sweep of history, it's just generally declined over time, and it's hard to really believe, therefore, that familiarity has just been getting less and less and less and less over such a long period of time. But either way, it appears that, that by various mechanisms, fans have an impact on match outcomes. So what we've done again is we've pulled data from the big 5 leagues. We've also pulled lower league data and cup data from Italy, because Italy has had more of a history of having these closed door matches, usually for hooliganism issues. And then we've also looked at European competition, the Champions League and the Europa League, which are competitions in which European teams from different countries compete against each other. In terms of the data, we can get some sense of the size of the crowds here. These are average crowds of about 16,000. In the data set, we've got hundreds of teams, and we've got a range of different referees, and we've got about 34,000 matches in total. We've got 161 matches behind closed doors, so that's a tiny fraction of the overall number of matches. And so to some extent, it's quite nice that we've now got a lot more closed door matches taking place, because it gives us a bigger sample. We also, since writing this paper, became aware of the Egyptian case, where in Egypt there's been no fans at football matches for about the last 6 or 7 years. So that's a long experiment in no fans in football matches. Here's where the matches have taken place without fans. There were a few before football was suspended, and there were a few over recent years with this spike because of Italy in 2006-07. What we do is we simply ask the question, is some outcome affected by there being no fans in the stadium? So essentially, we've got an indicator for if there was a match, if a match was taking place without fans, so we can look at the differences. So that's just technical stuff. Here is the actual plot, which shows you the differences that we observed in these matches pre-coronavirus shutdown. So the home teams won about 10% less often, and away teams won a little bit more often. Now these are, again, a bit like the previous plots. These little extra bars tell you that if 0 is within that range, that's insignificant. So the effect on draws, insignificant. The effect on home wins, significant. Fewer home goals, insignificantly more away goals. And then what else? The most significant effect and strongest effect that we found was on away yellow cards. So basically the mechanism that we saw pre-COVID-19 suspension was a player referee mechanism where referees are awarding fewer yellow cards. It could be that they feel less pressure to, because the crowd isn't responding to fouls, as we've learned from this previous evidence. But it could also be that players are responding differently as well. Players, maybe they engage in fewer dangerous challenges, the away players in particular, and so they get fewer yellow cards. Either way, away teams have got fewer yellow cards, and therefore they're able to defend, you might argue, more effectively, and therefore they concede fewer goals, and therefore they win more matches and lose fewer matches. The only other effect that's significant, these are all sorts of other statistics involved in football matches. The only other effect that's significant is the effect of shots on target being saved. So somehow goalkeepers appear to do better at saving shots. And again, it could be that keepers play better, or it could be that strikers are shooting from further away because they feel more confident because there are fewer fans there. A striker, when he's going to shoot on goal, will look up and look for the goal, and perhaps he'll therefore spot that there's no fan, will be distracted, and less of an effective shot, perhaps. We looked at injury time to try and get some sense of whether we could replicate this famous result, and we found very little effect of games being behind closed doors. So everything apart from the first half, 0 is within these bounds in terms of injury time being added or not added in the case of there not being any fans. We've got a whole bunch of tables here, and all these tables are doing basically is trying to control a little bit better for things that are going to matter when it comes to looking at these kinds of outcomes. So, for example, home team wins less often, but perhaps those closed door matches involve weaker home teams with stronger away teams. So we've got to control for that. So we control for that. We include fixed effects for the teams, home season fixed effects, away season. We include pairing the fixtures together to make sure it's two similar teams that have played each other before. When we do this, the effect on match outcomes tends to disappear. It's not as strong as our effect on yellow cards. So when we reduce down the sample, the effect is less significant. There are fewer of these stars. And there's no effect on goals scored once we begin to control for different, and also when we focus on different subsamples. So this is all of our matches. These are just matches in European competition. These are just matches in Italy, and these are just matches that we consider to be elite matches. So we strip out the lower division and cup matches in Italy, for example. So we can look at the data from all sorts of different angles and try and infer what we can about what's going on when games are taking place without spectators in the stadium. Then these are the home card effects in terms of yellow cards, red cards, discipline, nothing significant. And as mentioned, with the away yellow cards, this is an effect that, with the exception of European matches, retains its significance, or retains these stars throughout. A very strong effect is that there are fewer yellow cards for the away team in these matches without fans. Sorry, that's a slide that I've already showed you once. Now, just to kind of generalize the results before I wrap up, those results were all based on pre-COVID-19 suspension matches. And our first instinct was, well, it's going to be great. We're going to be able to use all the matches once the Bundesliga returns and once the other leagues return, to look at how and whether those results are borne out. We'll have a larger sample. We'll be able to tell whether indeed home teams win less often, whether it is an effect of yellow cards, whether there is an effect on how goalkeepers, defenders, attackers perform, and so on. But one thing that's important to note is that football has changed since the return. So firstly, of course, everyone's playing behind closed doors, whereas back in previous episodes, it was one team would be playing behind closed doors. They would be being punished, the home team, and they would be playing behind closed doors. But now everyone's playing behind closed doors, and they're not being played behind closed doors because of a punishment for anything that they've done or their fans have done. In addition, the game is different now because more substitutions are allowed. So that immediately does change the game in quite a significant way. The game is taking place at different times of the day, different times in the week, unusual times. And there is evidence out there that playing matches at unusual times does have an effect on outcomes. Nonetheless, this is a plot which tells us something about what's happened since the resumption of football. So this is month by month the proportion of football matches that end in particular outcomes. So the black line is the proportion of matches in a given month that end in a win for the home team. So you can see by and large, this is about 45%, fairly solidly around 45%. The first month in this sample is January 2016, running through to now July 2020. What you can see is nice, solid 45%. And then we hit, this is April, when it was just Belarusian matches. And this is May when the Bundesliga returned. And you can see that this complete loss of home advantage that was remarked upon as the big change when the Bundesliga returned is really quite apparent here, because you have almost as many. And this isn't just Bundesliga, of course, this is Bundesliga plus Belarus, plus a number of other leagues that began in May, Faroe Islands, Czech Republic, Estonia, and a few others. But you can see that there was essentially the same number of away wins as there were home wins. And that is unprecedented. It's a word that's used a lot, but it's unprecedented. But what you can see is that once more games return, so there were about 300 matches in May and there were about 800 matches in June. Home advantage appears to have pretty much returned. The home team is back to winning above 40% of matches, considerably more than the away team wins. But note that the away team is still winning more than it has done historically. So historically, it's winning about 30% of matches. And now it seems to be winning about 35% of matches. The real effect appears to actually be, at least so far, a fall off in the number of draws. Now this isn't consistent really with what we present. If we look here, we see no effect on draws, a small effect on away wins, and an effect on home wins. But actually what we've seen is the effect is more in terms of away wins and draws. So this is to say that matches are different now, and it may well be actually because of this difference in behavior, difference in all sorts of aspects of the match now, that things are a little bit different. One argument, the argument that I mentioned at the start, is familiarity. Maybe after the first few weeks, the teams got used to playing without the stadiums having any fans in. They were used to the stadium, their own stadium with fans.
Dr. James?
Yep.
Dr. James, yeah. You have 5 minutes left, so could you
5 minutes,
conclude?
perfect. That's
yes,
great.
because we need sometimes at the end for question and answer.
Yep.
Okay,
Thanks. Less than 5 minutes. Thanks,
thanks,
Michelle.
Okay, thank you.
And so maybe teams have become more familiar with playing without fans, and so that's why we've seen this readjustment here. So a different way of thinking about it is to look at, well, what do outcomes look like after teams have played a certain proportion of matches without spectators, without fans. And this is a look at the cumulative number of matches without spectators. Okay, so we've got here 0, teams have played 0 matches without spectators. So these are normal matches with fans. And this is the effect of a team playing its first match without spectators. We see that there's a fall off in the proportion of home wins, and a jump up in the proportion of away wins. Then as teams begin to play consecutive matches, so this is when teams are playing their second match without fans, their third match without fans, their fourth match without fans, their fifth match. And what you see is that the proportion of home wins is declining. Now, after about 5 matches, there still isn't very much data. We're basically then moving back to looking at the Egyptian data where teams have played for many years. So there aren't too many observations when we get across to here. But there does appear to be, at least for evidence here, an initial drop-off in performance, followed by some kind of resumption in home team performance, and also a fall back down for the away team as well. So perhaps familiarity is actually what's going on here. And just to finally kind of wrap up in the historical context, this is again the same plot from 2 back, but just in black and white. And then this is the longer historical pattern. So I mentioned that it was argued that post-Second World War, there was a big drop-off in home advantage. But actually, if you look at all matches, and this is all matches across all countries, as reported on the website worldfootball.net, what you can see is that there's been a steady decline over a long period of time. There hasn't been one sudden drop-off. It's been a steady decline since about the 1930s. And arguably, maybe even, the data's a bit more noisy here, maybe even a decline since football really began. This is the entire history of football, essentially. So a familiarity argument, perhaps, referee mechanism, perhaps, travel effects is high. It's not clear what necessarily the effect is on outcomes, other than to say that with the more data that's collected, certainly the more data on matches played without fans, the more we might learn about this and whether or not changes need to be made. Because fans attend matches because they think that their team's got a chance. If their team's the home team and their team's the underdog, they're perhaps more likely to attend a match if they think their team's got a chance. Behavioural patterns are all mixed up in all of these different aspects of outcomes of sporting events. So to wrap up, we've likely got an effect on demand patterns of COVID-19. There appear to be public health implications, certainly of indoor sporting events. Thinking therefore about whether events should be allowed to run and be able to run with spectators or not. And then if we don't have fans, well, football without fans, sport without spectators is different. The home advantage seems to be reduced. There appears to be this yellow card mechanism, and perhaps there are a few other effects as well. But it's possible that actually it's just a familiarity effect since things have begun to return back to normal again. A bit more self-referencing here. If you want to read more about this, a lot of the things that I've talked about are things that I've written about in a more descriptive piece with Carl Singleton, European Football After COVID-19, which is going into a book due out next month. A New World Post-COVID-19, Lessons for Business, the Finance Industry and Policy Makers. And if you want to access the paper, the link is just there. So I'm happy to stop there. We've got some time for questions if you have any for me.
Any question for Dr. James, please? I'm checking the chat window.
Okay, sure.
إذا في أحد من الحضور حابب يسأل أي سؤال ممكن يتفضل أو يرسل في الشات ويندو. يا أستاذة ريحان ممكن تعملي unmute or you can put your question at the chat window. أستاذة تسنيم ممكن تعملي unmute للأستاذة ريحان. أستاذة تسنيم.
السلام عليكم.
يا وعليكم السلام. أهلا دكتور طلال.
Yes. First, I would thank you, Dr. James, and I would like to thank Masha'il for this opportunity and also for the nice presentation and research. I would like just to ask a question, if you don't mind, how this could impact the value of the clubs, like if this is going to continue how it's going to affect the club economically, as well as the brand value of the club. You mentioned about Egypt. They have been playing without fans for a couple of months or even years, but we cannot generalize what's happening in Egypt similar to what is in Europe, because Europe, they are depending more on the sponsorships and also the broadcasting and everything. In Saudi Arabia, maybe we are not yet, even though we have a very strong football league, but maybe we are not yet having a very high financial value of the sponsorship. So how do you see that if it's going to affect the future of the brand value of the club as well as the economy?
Thank you. Yeah, so really interesting question. I think the effect on brands is, well, there's got to be an effect of this, because the teams are playing their matches without fans, and so it's affecting the product that they're producing. Fans aren't enjoying the experience of being a Manchester United match or a Liverpool match or something. So it has to have an effect. On a very simple basis, it's a reduction in the revenues available to clubs, and that additionally, may create problems for the financial viability of clubs. So certainly, if you move out of the Premier League in England, it's quite hard for most clubs to be able to sustain football matches if there isn't fans coming through into the stadiums to pay and watch matches. So there's a financial, there'll be a significant financial implication of COVID-19. In terms of, I guess, in Saudi Arabia, it does depend again on the extent to which the league depends on money from stadium attendees, or whether it depends more, as the Premier League does, on money from television companies. But that has to be an effect on the brand. And also, of course, there's another aspect of this, which is the way in which football clubs position themselves. So there were a lot of issues that football clubs in England found when they tried to access government schemes to support the economy, because it was said, well, hang on, these are, you're very wealthy football clubs with hundreds of millions of pounds. Why are you accessing public funds? So there's a lot of brand management that's been taking place throughout the crisis, certainly here in England.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ustaz Rihan. Dr. James?
Yep.
Yeah, Rihan, she has a question. How can you see Saudi market with COVID, Saudi football market with COVID-19?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Masha'al, and thank you for Dr. Talal أيضا for organizing this.
Dr. James?
Yep.
Yeah, Rihan, she has a question. How can you see Saudi market?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, Rayhan.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Rayhan.
Yeah.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Thank you, Dr. James, for for this presentation. It's very interesting as usual. And Dr. Masha'al, أيضا, it's an interesting host. And thank you for Dr. Talal أيضا for this charity, which is amazing collaboration. I have one main question, which I discussed with you, Dr. James, about the future of Saudi Arabia to enhance a new generation for new games. If you remember, we discussed it at the conference. And then how do you think this now we can, because Dr. Talal is here, so how can you see Saudi market to enhance female in football games and from Europe to be trained in different clubs in all over the world? It was during this time, especially in this pandemic, in this year as well, having trained a platform online training for those wanted to be trained in the future to enhance new games, let's say, for example, cricket, rowing, or football, any sport. Thank you.
Thank you, Rayhan. It's a very difficult question, how to how to encourage sport and especially women's sport as well. I think it's a very difficult question. Certainly here in England, I think there's been progress over recent years, because now if young girls are playing football, they do have a route to play football as a career, because there's a professional game for women now in England, whereas there wasn't 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And so if you were good at football and you're young, there was no career prospect from doing that. Whereas if you were young and a boy and good at football, there was a career prospect potentially from playing football more. So one thing is that the extent to which professionalization is supported, and that has to be something that's supported either by government somehow, or by, if you like, the charity from the Premier League, is the case in England. The financial, the amounts of money that come into the Premier League mean that can be redistributed and can be used to support the women's game, to enable it to achieve a kind of structure, a kind of sustainability that the men's game has.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
If I can add a few things, if you don't mind, Dr. James.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yes.
As you know, maybe the female participating on the sports in Saudi Arabia just started last year, and also there is like a target from the International Olympic. They have a target. They're supposed to reach or encourage more, all the sports organizations worldwide to have a 30% target of a female working on the hierarchy of the organizations on the sports. So I think Saudi, since this started, I'm sure they are not meeting that target, and it is a huge opportunities for the vocational training. Yesterday, we have the Saudi British Executive Committee meetings between the two sides, and the educations as well as the vocational online training. That is one of the hot topics were discussed on the meeting. So having said that, I think the Saudis not only need to be ready to have players on the field playing in all type of different sports, but also they need to have admin, managers, executives, also in the different, it's not only on the clubs as well as in the committee.
So it's like committee, society and committee have different chances, opportunities for those young generation to enhance them. As an online platform, you mean, Dr. Talal?
Yeah, they discuss because of the corona, and also because the acceptance of the online. In the past, if you go for in executive trainings, most of the people, they want to have a training to travel abroad, but now it comes as a common sense of having an online training. So vocational, either to go abroad, or since now it's acceptable to have it online, I think that is a huge opportunities. But also, expanded, they have a lot of new sport society and associations and federations. Some of them, I think you just mentioned one of the federations, Rihanna, or one of the opportunities where you can target
cricket or rowing or rugby or different sports.
Rowing is the UK is one of the best, and I think Cambridge.
And we are Reading, especially Reading.
Yeah, Cambridge and Reading. I think that some of the Saudi students, even they are camping there. So finding a talented female from the families, the Saudi families who are studying abroad, especially in the UK, I think that will be a huge opportunity to find talented people.
Yes, that's my dream, Dr. Talal. It's my dream.
I think that is a huge opportunity to make them ready to even reduce the cost, because they are going to be engaged in the UK, and they will come back with their families ready to compete.
So my strategy, Dr. Talal, and Dr. James as well, I've said it before, it's to collaborate with the bureau, the cultural bureau for different countries from Middle East, for example, to give the student children a discount and fund, and to collaborate with the British Chamber of Commerce here, with Arab Chamber of Commerce, to have this idea reduced and planned as a platform to enhance a new generation. by using the Chamber of Commerce, by using the Cultural Bureau for different countries in the UK. This is the starting point.
Fantastic. Well, let me just say with to Dr. Talal, I think the idea of getting that kind of a proportion of women working in sport in the administrative type roles is also fundamental, because these are the kinds of decisions that are made that affect all sorts of levels of sport. It's something that really strikes me when I think about the university, the economics profession. We have a very kind of white, Western-centric focus, because most economists are white Western economists, but it means that we have biases that we don't even necessarily realize. So it's fundamentally important to have that level of diversity in your structures if you're going to start to make the right kinds of decisions that reflect the kinds of diversity that we have amongst us, and lead us to better outcomes that better reflect who we actually are.
It's very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for all of you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. James. Thank you, Dr. Mishal. And thank you, Dr. Talal.
Okay, thank you, Rehan.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions? So shall we? So time is up. So we don't have any more questions at the chat window. So thank you, James, for your time, and thank you for all the attendance. And as I said before, if إذا تحبوا إنكم أنتم تكونوا أعضاء في الجمعية، طبعا الجمعية عندنا أنواع مختلفة من العضويات، وزي ما قلت إحنا الآن بنحضر لمؤتمر وأشياء كثيرة حتكون في المستقبل خاصة فقط بالأعضاء. Okay, thank you, James.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
أنا إن شاء الله معاكم كعضو بإذن الله قريبا إن شاء الله.
Okay.
الأسبوع القادم
إن شاء الله.
بإذن الله. دكتور طلال.
نعم.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور، دائما أرفع راسي فيك. Thank you so much.
الله يعطيكم العافية وموفقين إن شاء الله. شكرا لكم.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا للجميع.